Vithka Thyrsai watched the morning light filter through the translucent resin of the hive spire. Beside her, Cashin Wolf stood perfectly still. The organic balcony vibrated beneath their feet, a low thrumming that signaled the awakening of the lower spawning fields. She reached out, her chitinous fingers brushing the coarse fabric of his sleeve before settling on the warmth of his shoulder. The scent of her own pheromone mark clung to him, a sharp, citrusy note that declared his status to every Thyrsai within the tower. He was hers. They called it weakness. She called it patience. As a commandress of the fifth hive, Vithka was expected to choose a shield pair of significant military standing, perhaps a high-caste drone with reinforced carapace and acid glands. Instead, she had bonded with a human. The others in the High Council did not understand the quiet strength in his mammalian frame, nor did they see the way the galaxy seemed to steady itself whenever he drew breath. Her shield pair is a soft shell, the High Matriarch whispered, her pheromones thick with a mocking, sweet scent that drifted across the balcony. One sting and he liquefies. Vithka did not turn. Her antennae flattened, the Thyrsai equivalent of a dare. She felt the ripple of judgment from the gathered elite, their compound eyes clicking as they tracked Cashin's every move. He remained unbothered. His gaze was fixed on the horizon where the wind-exposed cliffs met the sky. He wore the chitin fragment ring she had carved for him, a token of their bond that looked like a jagged crown against his pale skin. The vibration in the floor changed. It was no longer the rhythmic pulse of the spawning fields. It was a frantic, discordant shudder. Vithka leaned over the resin railing. Far below, the shimmering silver of the rogue hive splinter emerged from the shadow of the canyon. 200 feral drones, driven by a madness that had stripped them of coordination, surged upward. They were a mass of twitching limbs and dripping mandibles, a swarm breach that ignored the standard protocols of the hive. They did not signal. They did not negotiate. They only hungered. The High Council erupted into a clicking chaos. Guards scrambled for their plasma lances, their pheromones spiking into a bitter, acrid cloud of panic. The feral drones were fast, their acid spit already sizzling against the lower organic walls of the spire. Kinetic energy scales with mass and velocity squared. A charging swarm of 200 organisms at 40 kilometers per hour generates roughly 3 megajoules of combined kinetic energy. Redirecting that force into a single point would exceed the impact of a .50 caliber round by a factor of 80. Cashin stepped forward. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. Vithka watched him, her primary eyes wide, her secondary sets focusing on the way the air seemed to thicken around his hands. She felt a surge of pride so intense it warmed her inner carapaces. She had always known this moment would come. Cashin, she clicked softly. He didn't look back. He merely stepped onto the very edge of the balcony, his boots crunching on the resin. The first wave of feral drones cleared the railing, their wings buzzing like 1,000 saws. The lead feral drone slammed into Cashin's chest with the force of a falling boulder. He didn't flinch. Instead of the sound of breaking bone, there was a heavy, metallic thrum, the sound of a bell being struck deep underwater. He stood like a pillar of iron as the next 10 drones collided with him in a frantic, shrieking wave of chitin and hunger. They clawed at him, their mandibles scraping against the invisible field of his skin, each impact feeding the humming vibration that now radiated from his core. Vithka stood her ground. Behind her, the High Council shrieked in terror as acid spit hissed against the resin, but she only had eyes for her human. He was no longer a man. He was a battery, gorging himself on the kinetic violence of the swarm. He waited until the peak of the charge. When the air was thick with the stench of feral pheromones and the balcony was nearly overrun, Cashin Wolf planted his feet and released it all, redirected their own swarm charge back through them. The shockwave was a physical wall. It didn't just push the drones. It disintegrated them. The 3 megajoules of stolen momentum exploded outward in a focused cone of absolute pressure. Feral drones were turned into silver mist and shrapnel midair. The sound was a singular, bone-shaking crack that silenced the entire spire. The canyon grew still. Small fragments of chitin drifted down like snow onto the resin floor. The air, once foul with aggression, was now hollow and quiet. Cassian stood at the edge of the abyss, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic breath. The energy rippling through his skin faded, leaving only the dull glow of the chitin ring on his finger. Vithka stepped through the settling dust. She ignored the high matriarch, whose compound eyes were wide with a terror that would never truly fade. The softshell had just erased a small army with a single gesture. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly with a pride that felt like fire in her veins. Cassian turned. The violence had left no mark on him, no stain on his calm. He walked back to her side, resuming his position exactly one pace behind and to her left. He didn't seek praise. He didn't look at the survivors. He pressed his forehead to her chitin, a human gesture she'd learned to crave. "Are you harmed, Vithka?" he asked, his voice a low anchor in the silence. "No," she clicked, her antennae rising in a triumphant arc. She looked at the council, her gaze cold and possessive. They would never speak of him as a pet again. They would never question why a commandress of the Thyrisi would bond with a creature of soft skin and warm blood. The hive splinter had no leader. After Cassian, it had no members either. He stood behind her, a silent shadow that held the power of a collapsing star. She leaned back into his warmth, feeling the steady thrum of his heart against her carapace. The universe was vast, cold, and often foolish, but it was finally starting to learn the truth about what belonged to her.